Leaving the small ring of wilderness around Mount Hood in Oregon, the Mount Hood National Forest has been radically altered by decades of logging. Further south, the Mackenzie Valley provides another textbook example of the different types of forest ownership in the Northwest. Heading east, just as we saw in the Olympics, we first pass over private industrial timberlands, covered in clear-cuts and tree farms. As we approach the Willamette National Forest, the Elk Mountain roadless area appears as a patch of dark green. As we enter the Willamette National Forest, we leave the foothills for the Cascade Mountains. Zooming ahead a bit, we see a large area of intense clear-cutting on the boundary of the wilderness area, almost out of spite it seems. And finally, at the crest of the Cascade Mountains, we see the remnants of the original forest cover. The forests of the western U.S. and Canada were once one great wilderness. This wilderness has been heavily compromised in the U.S., but there are still parts of British Columbia to the north that can show us what it used to be like. The Great Bear Rainforest is the largest area of intact temperate rainforest on Earth at about 15 million acres. It's revered for its majestic wild landscapes, its rich First Nations culture and history, its seemingly endless stretches of wild, unbroken forest, and for its charismatic fauna, eagles, salmon, and grizzly bears. After decades of conflict, a deal was struck in 2006 between the BC government, timber companies, and some environmental groups and First Nations, which protects about 30% of the Great Bear Rainforest. About 10 million acres or 15,000 square miles will still remain unprotected under this agreement. Elsewhere in British Columbia, it's easy to see why the province has drawn the attention of the world over the years for its logging practices. One only has to fly a bit east of the coast in the Great Bear Rainforest to see what happens when the timber industry and the BC government manage BC's native forests. Clear-cuts all throughout the BC mainland go on as far as the eye can see in all directions. Almost all of the land in British Columbia is public, so almost all of this logging is on public lands. And almost all of it is in native forest, unlike in the United States. These forests regenerate more slowly since they're farther north, and the BC government practices what they call fiber farming, where natural forests are converted into tree farms. This conversion of natural forest ecosystems into industrial tree farms is pretty much standard practice on private timberlands in the United States as well. On national forests, it's more complicated, but it's certainly practiced throughout different parts of the country. Here's a typical young plantation on the Willamette National Forest in Oregon. While it may not look quite like a Christmas tree farm, it's almost nothing like the kind of forest that it replaced. This is by no means just a U.S. phenomenon. This Costa Rican forest is home to 400 butterflies, 500 bird species, 400 orchids alone, and an incredible 600 tree species. Teak plantations nearby are home to a few birds and a lot of insects, but that's about it. Back in the U.S., on private timber industry lands, there's a bit of an effort to convey a sense of forest stewardship, but behind the scenes, they really make no bones about the fact that it's tree farming. Here on the Olympic Peninsula, the native forest in this location was originally harvested, quote-unquote, in the 1930s, and is now being managed as a tree plantation on a 50-year rotation. This may not mean so much if you're not aware of what natural forests on the peninsula are like, but the wet forests of the western Olympic Peninsula are naturally home to old forests full of giant trees, with many forest stands that haven't seen fire for centuries. So we're really talking about apples and oranges ecologically in this case. This large-scale conversion of natural forest ecosystems into industrial tree farms is a huge ecological issue that the general public doesn't really grasp. The whole discussion about forests and forest conservation in the country today is a bit disingenuous and takes place in a somewhat bizarre context, a sort of collective state of denial and make-believe, given that so much of the land is not really forested but in more of an agricultural operation. One that, given its very nature, with all of the roads and the heavy machinery and scraping the ground bare and the herbicides, has a huge impact on the land. It doesn't take a genius or a scientist to see that a bunch of bare dirt isn't the same as a temperate rainforest. The continued degradation of our public forests, which provide much of the nation's recreation, wildlife habitat, and drinking water, is really difficult to comprehend, given how much the losses outweigh any perceived gains. What's clear is that these public forests, especially after 100 years, have a much higher value than to be roaded and logged. Now's the time to make the change, instead of allowing more harm to come to these lands. It's a policy that respects the hundreds of thousands of other species that we share the land with, our federal treasury, and future generations of our children who have to live with whatever environmental reality we create for them. It's time to say no, that enough is enough, and that we want the beginning of a new era on our public lands.
I see my freedom from across the way, and it comes right